Sometimes the most dangerous thing that we do to one another is reducing an entire human life to one single label. And honestly, the world does this constantly. We take complicated people and we flatten them into categories of successful, failure, addict, divorced, too emotional, a troublemaker, too much, not enough. And once a label sticks, it becomes very difficult to remove that label and that sticky residue that comes with it. And honestly, as a pastor, as someone who preaches from the Bible, I see this often even within the ancient text. I see the way that messages are perceived about these communities and these people that encountered God and encountered Jesus. And there's two specific stories that I would like to bring up today. One of them is found within the Old Testament, the book of Exodus. And the Israelites had just escaped slavery in Egypt. After generations of oppression, they finally walked away from everything that was familiar to them and stepped into the wilderness, hoping that God was leading them towards freedom. But freedom didn't feel free immediately because it was a desert. They were exhausted, they were uncertain, and now they were in a desert with no water. And then their children became thirsty, and their livestock became thirsty. So they turned to Moses, who was their leader, and said, "Is God with us or not?" Oh man, and for generations, people have perceived that one comment and labeled this community as faithless, ungrateful, grumblers, complainers. But honestly, if my kids were thirsty, I'd press for some really hard questions. If your family, if your friends, if your loved ones were thirsty, you'd probably ask those same hard questions. Because this is not a story about bad people. This is a story about thirsty people, about real people. And what God does in the moment is he meets them not with shame, but he tells Moses to strike a rock and water flows. God meets them in the middle of their fear and uncertainty with grace. There's another more familiar story of labels that we've placed on people found within the New Testament, within the Gospel of John. And Jesus is traveling through this place of Samaria, which is a place that most Jewish religious leaders avoided at the time because of social and ethnic divisions. And there, in the heat of the day, Jesus meets this woman at the well. Now, culturally, this conversation should have never taken place. A Jewish man speaking publicly to a Samaritan woman was already crossing these major social boundaries. But Jesus starts that conversation of, "Will you give me a drink?" Identifying yet another basic human need of thirst. And what follows is one of the longest and deepest recorded conversations that Jesus has with anyone throughout all of the Gospels. And yet, for generations, people have reduced this woman to a single label. People assume her whole identity is summed up by the past relationships she had. But if you listen closely to the story that takes place within John chapter 4, and you hear her whole story, she's thoughtful, she's smart, she's honest, she's spiritually curious, and she's asking deep questions to Jesus about God and worship and about truth. And by the end of the story, she actually goes back to her home and tells everybody in her town about this Jesus. See, the label never told the whole story about who she was, because labels rarely tell the truth about who people and communities are. I experienced this personally just several weeks ago. I was at a book launch event. Actually, it was the book launch event for Cathedrals of Connection by Matt Matson, who is the leader of this Between ministry. If you've not already ordered a copy, cathedralsofconnection.com. And this book launch party took place in my hometown. And as I was in this room filled with amazing people, somebody caught my attention. It was my high school guidance counselor. And in that moment, these memories flooded my mind as if I was 17 years old again. Because high school was a very difficult season for me. It was a season where a lot of labels got placed and attached to me. Some of them from other people, and a lot of them from myself that I quietly carried. You know how that works. One familiar face, one familiar place, one scent, and all of a sudden, all these old stories start rushing back into your mind. And before I could even process all of this that I was feeling internally, she beelined it across the room for me and embraced me in the biggest, warmest hug. She said, "I am so proud of you." And in that moment, the labels lost their grip. I can't fully explain it in words, but something shifted in me in that moment. Because for a moment, I was not seen as these worst assumptions about who I was. I was being seen as who I had become. And most importantly, I was being seen as who God had been forming all along. And I think that's what we can glean from both of these stories. I think that's why these stories matter so much. Because every single day we stand in the spaces between one another, between strangers, between neighbors, between generations, between political differences, between assumptions, between hurt and healing, between who someone was and who they are still becoming. And the world trains us to fill that space quickly with judgment and certainty and with labels. But God invites us to something else. Every day we're invited into something different, something more compassionate, something filled with more presence and more love. That's the holy work, to resist reducing people to single labels, to become curious about stories we don't fully know, to leave room for grace to exist, to believe people are more than the worst thing that ever happened to them or the worst thing that was ever said about them. Because the space between us is sacred. Amen. Hey, this message is for you. If this message meant anything to you, please share it, send it to people in your lives, and remember that the space between us is sacred. Now go with God's love and create the church between.